Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly analyze the main tactical theme in Arsenal's 1-0 win at Chelsea. So in today's video, first we're going to analyze Chelsea's shape, then we'll focus on Arsenal's build-up, and lastly we'll focus on how both sides look to press. So when we break it all down and we do look at the board, we have Arsenal's first team 11 with Zinchenko moving into a left-back role, and Chelsea moving to a 4-2-3-1. Now the reason why Chelsea may be looking to play a 4-2-3-1 here was due to the fact that they could go 3v3 in that midfield zone, with Havertz tracking the movement of Thomas Partey, while Loftus-Cheek can match Xhaka's power and movement going up front, and Jorginho could track the movement of Odegaard.
Mason Mount started on the left-hand side, and it was probably to allow him to drift centrally into pockets of space between the lines to help create overloads and to receive the ball in tight, dangerous spaces so that he could play in one of Havertz or Aubameyang looking to break in behind or attempt to switch the play out to Sterling to get him into 1v1s. If that wasn't the case, he could simply be used as a decoy to drag White laterally in towards narrow positions,
and that could encourage Cucurella to push forward to peg back Saka, whereas on the right-hand side you have a direct threat against Zinchenko, where in bigger games Man City was targeted by the opposition, and then you have defensive cover to deal with Martinelli in Azpilicueta. Up front, where Saliba and Gabriel could bully Aubameyang and match him for pace, perhaps Potter was looking to have Havertz push forward beyond Thomas Partey at times to occupy one of the center backs, and that would allow Aubameyang space to get into 1v1s or to break in behind. And if Chelsea looked to go direct, they could perhaps have Havertz flicking the ball into the path of Aubameyang to break beyond that Arsenal backline as well.
We didn't see any major changes from Arsenal in terms of how they wanted to attack.
Martinelli and Saka hugged the touchline, and then Xhaka and Odegaard were pushing beyond Jorginho and Loftus-Cheek to peg them back. So what you end up seeing here is that you have Zinchenko and White in the fullback roles and Thomas Partey operating as a single pivot. So essentially that does mean that Chelsea are outnumbered 5v4, and you're expecting Aubameyang and Havertz to help each other out with pressing the center backs and blocking off the passing lane into Thomas Partey, or simply having one of the two attacking players step towards the ball-carrying center back while the other one sat on Thomas Partey and then was prepared to shoot out to the free center back if he received the ball, and the other attacking player would drop off to Thomas Partey. For instance, if Aubameyang stepped out to Gabriel, he'd block off the passing lane to Thomas Partey, but Havertz would also be sitting on the single pivot as well. If Gabriel looked to push the ball square to Saliba, then from there Havertz could shoot out towards Saliba, and Aubameyang could drop off on Thomas Partey. If there was a situation where Potter wanted both of the attacking players to close down the center backs, you could simply have them closing down the passing lane into Thomas Partey, and if that wasn't the case, they could have Loftus-Cheek or Jorginho stepping towards Thomas Partey, and then have one of the center backs closing down the shuttlers. However, what we ended up seeing here was that Arsenal did create issues for Chelsea, but Chelsea are also responsible for their downfall, because you had Havertz sitting on Thomas Partey, you had Aubameyang pushing out towards Saliba, but then the issue that they had here now was that Sterling and Mount were dealing with White and Zinchenko. Essentially, if Aubameyang can't close down both of the center backs, then you'd have Sterling stepping towards Gabriel and blocking off the passing lane in towards Zinchenko, and then you need Azpilicueta to push out to close down the left back if he received the ball. But in the early stages of that game, Zinchenko ended up drifting laterally in towards that midfield zone, and that essentially witnessed Arsenal shift to that 3-2-5 that we've seen on a consistent basis this season. From here, Sterling was uncertain whether to stick with Zinchenko or be prepared to close down Gabriel, and that's where we initially witnessed Arsenal bypass the Chelsea front line to get Zinchenko on the ball, and from there Zinchenko was capable of progressing play, and Arsenal were capable of getting themselves in towards Chelsea's third.
From the left-hand side of that 3-2-5, with Gabriel was the spare man, there were two ways that he was capable of harming that Chelsea backline. One would be looking to play balls around Azpilicueta for Martinelli running off him to break into the left channel, and the other would be Zinchenko running off Sterling if Zinchenko did place himself near the left touchline, and from there with Xhaka occupying Loftus-Cheek, it would allow Zinchenko to break forward beyond Martinelli and Azpilicueta in towards the left channel. But when Zinchenko and Martinelli were placed in these positions, they failed to have an impact in the final third. The initial alternative that Potter could resort to would be having Aubameyang press the two center backs so that Havertz could stick on Thomas Partey, Sterling could occupy Zinchenko, and then Mount could push out into the path of White. But the issue that they encountered here was that unlike Gabriel Jesus, Aubameyang simply doesn't have the work rate to close down both center backs effectively. In many ways, the better option would be to simply have Sterling pushing forward to close down Gabriel, Havertz dropping off towards Zinchenko, and then have Aubameyang sitting on Thomas Partey until the ball is switched out to Saliba, and then from there Aubameyang can close him down while Havertz retreats into the path of Thomas Partey, and Sterling drops off on Zinchenko. On the occasion where Zinchenko pushed out towards the touchline, it was much beneficial towards Chelsea because Sterling could simply track his movement in towards that zone, and then they ended up having Havertz pushing out into the path of Gabriel but blocking off the passing lane in towards Thomas Partey and forcing Gabriel to play passes towards the touchline or in those wider areas. However, if Zinchenko did persist with moving into that midfield zone and they had Sterling pushing out to Gabriel and Havertz sitting on the left back, then what ended up happening here for Chelsea was that with Aubameyang blocking off the passing lane in towards Thomas Partey, it allowed Saliba time on the ball, and he was now finding passing lanes around Mount in towards Saka. That was one avenue that was successful for Arsenal to bypass the Chelsea press. However, Saka ended up encountering his own issues, being unable to beat Cucurella 1v1, and what ended up happening there was that the Chelsea left back often got help from Mount tracking back and Jorginho shifting laterally to make it a 1v2 or at times a 1v3 to halt Saka's threat from that right channel. The same thing applied on the left-hand side for Martinelli, who struggled to get the better of Azpilicueta on a consistent basis, and whenever he ran at Azpilicueta, you often saw Sterling dropping back deeper to make it a 1v2. Nevertheless, one of Arsenal's better chances throughout the game from open play stemmed from Martinelli in a 1v1 with Azpilicueta and getting some help from Xhaka's vertical run that allowed Martinelli to cut across Azpilicueta and Loftus-Cheek to successfully pick out Gabriel Jesus, breaking free at the back post, but from point blank range he nodded his effort wide of the net. Outside of that, the other key factor to Arsenal's success to bypass the Chelsea press was the movement of Odegaard, and he would often look to shift laterally away from Jorginho to receive the ball, and when he did do that, he was capable of receiving it free and then helping Arsenal progress their play. The manner in which Chelsea looked to overcome that was simply having Mount dropping off a bit narrow, blocking off the passing lane in towards Odegaard, and if the ball was pushed out towards White, then that would spring the press from Mount to push forward to close down the Arsenal right back, and it would give Jorginho time to shift laterally to close him down. Therefore, when we shift to Arsenal's press, we did witness some variation in terms of how they look to close down this Chelsea backline. Rather than going with a two-man press and having one of the wide players help out Gabriel Jesus to close the center backs, or simply relying on Odegaard, we ended up seeing Arsenal in more of a 4-1-4 shape. They had Gabriel Jesus tasked with closing down both center backs, and we'll get to that in a minute, whereas Martinelli and Saka closed down Cucurella and Azpilicueta, and then it allowed Odegaard and Xhaka to push forward to occupy Loftus-Cheek and Jorginho, while Thomas Partey tracked the movement of Havertz. One of the interesting feats of this Arsenal press was that Gabriel Jesus wasn't too worried about Saliba, and he often looked to close down Mendy or Thiago Silva, but he often blocked off the passing lane in towards Saliba to force Thiago Silva forward. From there, if Mount was looking to receive the ball near the touchline, White would close him down as Saka was closing down Cucurella, and there were times we ended up seeing Mount looking to drift in towards central areas, and that would result in two scenarios. One would be Saka looking to play a bit more narrow and block off the passing lane towards Mount or be within close proximity to close him down, and if the ball was pushed out towards Cucurella, then that would see Saka shifting over to close down the Chelsea left back. If Saka closed down Cucurella and then Mount dropped off in towards the midfield zone, then that's where you'd see Thomas Partey pushing forward to close down Mason Mount, and that would result in one of the spare center backs stepping towards Havertz. Ultimately, there was the rare occasion where Odegaard did close down Thiago Silva to help Jesus with the press, and Odegaard would simply block off the passing lane in towards Jorginho. But for the most part, what you ended up seeing was that Chelsea were okay with Saliba stepping forward as they were closing down all of his passing options. And from there, if Saliba looked to push forward, Gabriel Jesus would shift laterally to close him down if there was a threat. However, what you ended up seeing from Jesus was that he was waiting for Chelsea to cycle the ball out towards Mendy. He'd block off the passing lane in towards Saliba and then simply look to close down Thiago Silva once he received possession. The manner in which Chelsea looked to overcome this press was by simply having Mendy get on the ball, and from there they formed a temporary back three with Azpilicueta and Cucurella pushing forward, and that's where you'd see Martinelli now being forced to close down Saliba. And from here, on several occasions, what we ended up witnessing was that Zinchenko would cover for Martinelli, and Chelsea would look to play long balls over the press into the path of Sterling, making runs into the space beyond Zinchenko. This was a reoccurring theme throughout that opening half, and frankly, whenever Chelsea were able to win possession in that midfield zone, they were looking to ping balls in beyond the advanced fullbacks. Sterling was consistently getting forward beyond Zinchenko to break down that right channel in transition. In this example, you witness Havertz getting to the ball before Gabriel when Azpilicueta steps into Martinelli, and he lays it off into the path of Jorginho and focus on Sterling beyond Zinchenko. From there, Jorginho ends up sliding the ball into the gap of space beyond Zinchenko and across Gabriel to play Sterling in free, and that allows Sterling to now get in a 1v1 with Gabriel as he shifts over to cover for Zinchenko. As that play develops, you witness Sterling sliding the ball across Gabriel for Havertz's run off Thomas Partey, and from here you can see that Havertz receives the ball in right half space, Saliba has to shift across to cover, and that leaves Aubameyang free breaking towards the 6-yard area. However, Saliba does a very good job of shifting over to close down Havertz quickly, and it forces him into a tame effort on goal. And there was one situation in particular where you witnessed Jorginho winning possession off Thomas Partey, and then picking out the run of Havertz breaking beyond Ben White down that channel. However, unfortunately for Chelsea, when Havertz broke forward in towards the penalty area, he failed to get beyond Saliba, who was covering for his right back. But nevertheless, one of Chelsea's brighter moments throughout that game was simply when they were capable of winning possession, whether it be Zinchenko or Tierney, they were simply pinging balls over the top into space for Sterling to break forward. But the issue that Chelsea encountered here was that when they broke into good positions in the final third, similar to Arsenal, when they broke in around the penalty area, they simply lacked the execution to punish the away side.
However, where Arsenal's winner did stem from a few individual mental lapses defending a set piece, the contrast between Gabriel Jesus' lead press and Aubameyang's lead press was decisive, and you could see that in the build-up to the corner kick that Arsenal won, as it was Gabriel Jesus inviting Thiago Silva to push forward, and then tracking back to get himself on the ball, win possession, and then exploit the space that Thiago Silva left behind by combining in right half space, and it resulted in Gabriel Jesus forcing a save out of the keeper that resulted in the corner.
So as you could see, this was a comfortable win for Arsenal, in which Graham Potter will likely receive criticism for his team and system selection, but here Arsenal's off-ball work rate and pressing proved decisive.